So, an absolute pleasure to have the chance to introduce to you today what I hope will be an intellectually augmented panel, to use your analogy from before. We have a wonderful group of people to discuss the themes that Charles-Edouard has brought up in his keynote. So, if we start from the end, we have Eric Daimler. Eric is the co-founder of CogX AI, himself a serial entrepreneur, the AI authority during the last year of the Obama administration in the US, board member at Podium, which is SoftBank Innovation Fund's largest investment in AI, and author of the forthcoming playbook on AI. So wonderful to have you, Eric. We have Gilad Novik, who is a partner at Lakestar Ventures. Lakestar invests in early and growth stage businesses in the US and Europe. Next, we have Alexandra Mousavizadeh, who is a partner at Tortoise Media. Alexandra comes from many years' experience in the ratings and indexing business, but is now a partner at Tortoise, which is a new news media business, and is running their intelligence team. Next to her, we have Antonia Romeo. Antonia is the permanent secretary at the Department for International Trade. The Department for International Trade, if you've not come across it before, leads the whole of the UK government's work for promoting British trade across the world. And then, of course, you've had the chance to meet Charles-Edouard before. So I wanted to kick off, actually, to bring out some of the themes that you talked about in the keynote, Charles-Edouard. Really starting, I guess, with two big themes that I took away. One was this trend of, I suppose, disintermediation of the people that we thought might have led the AI debate. So this is the big companies, the GAFAs, as you talk about, but also the disruptive startups. You know, is that a trend that others recognize in terms of where the new ideas and the new investments are happening? And I think the second trend I'd like to pick up, which you referenced also, was that actually it's the corporates that could be the decisive game changers in the way the future investment climate might operate. Eric, as a fellow author to Charles-Edouard, perhaps you could pick up on that to start with.
Yeah, the second question I can take first. So I came into my grateful experience with the Obama White House with a big vision of AI, and I came out with an even bigger vision. I went and afterwards, with that bigger vision, thought that where we can make the biggest difference in AI is in ordinary companies, traditional industries. I think there's actually an over-concentration in this focus on just learning algorithms, just developing learning algorithms. And when we think about who's going to win the AI race, there's a little bit of a nomenclature issue, because there's this fantastic wellspring of experience in traditional industries, I think, that is tremendously undervalued. The place that I bet my money after my White House experience was raising a couple $100 million in the United States. We actually purchased traditional companies and then transformed them with technical teams that I had recruited. That's not the traditional way people think of taking advantage of the opportunities in AI, but it's been a terrific playbook.
Fantastic. Alexandra, I know you wanted to pick up on some of the themes that Charles-Edouard mentioned.
I mean, so as you said, I'm running the intelligence side at the new media platform called Tortoise Media, and we're just about to launch a new global AI index, which picks up on some of the themes in the previous panel, but also some of the themes that you touched on. And it sort of sprung from a question that the Danish Prime Minister asked, because he said, you know, we think we're pretty great at flexibility and being prepared and sort of future forward thinking, but we really don't know, because we don't have the comprehensive set of benchmarks to measure ourselves against our neighbors and across Europe, but also across the world. So we sat down and we thought about sort of there are ways in which we're measuring how much goes into sort of the front end of AI, so the capital that goes in, the talent that's available in a country, but also the research that's generated, which of course looks at the capacity of a country going forward and in order to sort of, on the innovation side, but also on the implementation side, looking at the readiness, which was touched upon also in your talk, but also in the previous panel. So what needs to be in place in order to harness the upside of the implementation of that? So skills alignment, what does that mean? We don't really know what we're preparing for, but we know we need to be flexible. We know we need to have flexible labor markets, flexible educational systems. We know we need to be very focused on agile skill alignment. We know we have to have a proper operating environment, infrastructure, physical and non-physical, et cetera. So we are putting together this comprehensive index that looks across these parameters in order to create the roadmap for policymakers, but also for citizens to look at what are the things that we need to be aware of and cognizant of going into this AI-driven future, and have the opportunity to create that step change in growth if we get it right. And so we look at it from, the big corporates obviously play a big role in this, but we also need to be aware of that each country has to, and is thinking about their own AI strategies and using this as a roadmap for sort of guideposts or benchmarks in terms of how to get it right for the future.
So if I may stick with you 1 second, Alexandra, to just delve a little bit further into the country investment analysis that came out with the work that you'll launch this week. What were the headlines? Did it match up with what Charles-Edouard was talking about in his presentation, particularly vis-a-vis China?
Well, I mean, China and the US are obvious leaders in this, and when we talk about the race, they are far ahead. But I think in terms of just from an index perspective, and when you're looking at countries and how they fit into this debate about the race and what role they play, there are lots of, the capital that is spent in the US and China is obviously far outpacing anywhere else. But there are lots of capital that is invested in smaller countries that are making big headways. We're looking at Israel, Estonia, Finland, and elsewhere. And so, so that needs to be taken into account where we're looking at what does that, within the context of the country, there's a lot of investment taking place in specific areas that are leading, but also what we get from the index is, models that work. What is it that we can draw lessons from? Is it a Finnish educational system? Is it a Danish flexible labor market system? Is it, what can we draw of lessons from Israel, et cetera? So that really sets the stage for, maybe it is not one country that's getting everything right. Maybe it is bits and pieces from each country.
Well, I'd love to maybe drill down a bit into what individual countries are doing, and maybe we'll be able to extract some of those lessons you referred to. Mm-hmm. Maybe, Antonia, we could start with you to give us a sense of what is the investment climate for AI right here in the UK?
Well, look, thank you. I'm interested that Alexandra didn't mention the UK, because, of course, although we're well behind the US and China for now, while Europe has only 10% of the total global unicorns, the UK has 40% of those. And we've got more early-stage AI startups in the UK than in Germany and France combined. So while the race is on, we very much think that we are playing in a leading spot in Europe for that. By the way, I do think that Europe should be working together, actually, to make it work more widely. I think that this point about education and talent is really important. I mean, what is it that the UK is doing? We've obviously got 4 of the top 10 universities in the world. We've now got 16 AI centres across 14 universities in the UK. And as part of what we've been doing is very much focusing on putting ethics at the heart of what we're doing. We've got the Centre for Data Ethics. We've got the AI Council. We see all this as very much a joint venture between government, so I work for the government, business and academia, to really drive forward AI, because if you don't get all the sectors working together, you're not going to get the right sort of investment climate. So the government can do things in terms of providing funding, but actually you need to have funding, you need the ecosystem with the VCs, you need to have peer groups and people who've already done it, teaching other areas. We've got 1,000 AI companies in the UK, so we're always looking for organizations to be teaching each other. I mean, why is CogX here in London? It's for exactly that reason.
And maybe to look at a very different example of a success story, Gilad, you could tell us a little bit more about what's happening in Israel.
Sure, absolutely. So I might be a little bit biased because I'm from Israel, but I think that AI actually is really strong in Israel. Just as an example, in 2014, we had like 512 companies dealing with the AI. At the end of 2018, there were like 1,015 companies. It's growth of 120%. That's coming from for different reasons. One of them is actually the Israeli entrepreneurs are quite unique and special. Some of them are actually coming from a long military service that they've specialized in a specific technology that they try to actually commercialize it after they come to the army. Second option is the education system. So I'm actually sitting on the board of governors of the Technion University of the Israeli Technion, and a lot of programs run with big companies, big corporations. So Intel, for example, invested in new development chipsets, $11 billion. Quite a lot of it is actually into AI. All the other big corporates are investing a lot into Israeli AI companies as well. Just as an example, Alexa development was actually done in Israel with a group of AI specialists and many, many others.
And maybe I can come back to you, Charles-Edouard, because you talked a bit about mathematicians being one of the key strengths of France. But what are the other things that you're seeing from the French ecosystem, particularly reference investment?
Okay, I'm French, but I'm not advocating for France, but I can understand that everyone is advocating for their own countries.
Static fact,
Yes,
I would call it.
yes, exactly. I think it's a good news that everyone is striving on AI, and I think it's also good news that at the European level we try to consolidate and work together. French is very good for mathematics, but as I was saying, what is very important for AI is applied mathematics and physics, the ability to combine mathematics with reality. And if you have a middle field person, he might not be able to really implement any AI because, back to your point, is you have to go into a company and apply it. And if you are too far in the cloud, you might not be able to implement. So I think what we have in France is this combination. And the startup mechanism is starting to be better. But again, as I said, it's a combination of push from the government, education system, ability to access data, and financing. And then the scale of the market on which you can apply, because when you're in China, as I've shown with the numbers, you're talking about hundreds of millions of customers immediately, and then you can really make a lot of money. So I'm very positive on France, I'm positive on Europe, despite the fact that it's squeezed between US and China, and I think Israel also is doing a good job.
So maybe let's come back to the two that are doing the squeezing. So we spent quite a lot of time talking about China with the useful insights in your presentation, Charles-Edouard, but maybe, Eric, I can come back to you. Obviously, when you came into the Obama administration, you were looking at the sort of US landscape as a whole. What do you see as the trends that are coming out of the US that we should be looking at from a global perspective?
Yeah, so the really big deal here is that I think there's a huge misconception that the AI race, we'll call it, will only be won by who invents AI algorithms. That application of AI can be equally or perhaps more powerful. If we think of Amazon or Google and Facebook, and we think of the Chinese competitors, is there any distinction necessarily about who invented the technology versus who's applying it? It's not really. They're all very large companies, all hugely successful. And it's in the application of AI, applied AI, that I think Europe and Israel can continue to actually be leaders. It's in taking ordinary companies and applying AI technologies inside of those companies that all of the other countries could be leaders and can fully take advantage of the promise of AI. And the last point on mathematics, I'm going to disagree on one point and agree on another. I think that it may be heretical to say that we don't need some math, but if I were to choose, I suggest that we diminish the importance of geometry, trigonometry, and calculus. That we've seen a split in mathematics, not unlike chimpanzees and humans, from calculus, physics, that has more to do with our physical world, and it's seen its day, farm equipment, automobiles, airplanes. But that doesn't have a lot of usefulness in the digital world. The math for the digital world is category theory. It's an extension of graph theory with a little more constraints. Category theory is what all the children should learn, it's what we should learn, and it's the math upon which all the future technologies will be built.
So, on the assumption that we're all in agreement that one of the huge opportunities will be that the existing multinational businesses from wherever they are in the world, whoever applies, to use your language and what you talked about in your presentation, Charles-Edouard, the AI first and keeps ahead of the game because they've, really taken that step. Let's look at it from the perspective of those bigger companies. How do they do that? Because as you rightly said, culture is a big inhibitor to actually implementation. What do the biggest companies need to do? Are there companies out there that you all admire as being leaders in this application of AI race?
I can take this very quickly. You can't automate what you can't formalize, what you can't articulate. IBM says half of all AI projects, your AI projects, will fail. And the reason I suggest that they fail is because 80% of the resources for any of your AI projects should be put into the data. Should be put into understanding and then working with the data before you actually do anything. And what companies so often fail to do is they'll mention on the board of directors call, to the investor call or to the board of the directors, we do AI. But if you actually look deeply into it and how they're implementing it, they have no idea. You really have to first start, this is the takeaway, first start, what job do you want to automate? And that's what they're doing wrong.
To build, I fully agree, because the two things they're doing wrong is on data, they're trying to create this huge data lake to store everything instead of thinking which problem I'm trying to solve.
Data lake's a mistake.
Yes. And it's, I mean, there's no limit to a data lake, because they're producing every week more data than they've ever produced, and it's impossible to store, and by the time they store, they realize this is the wrong data. The second thing they're doing wrong is very often they think it's magic, the AI world. And the reality is, I tell them, okay, what's your problem? What do you want to automate? What question you want to answer? The quality of your yogurt, the pricing of your products. And they think that AI is a magic, and when you look at the real world, it's different, So they do their businesses, they make decisions, they recruit people. This is the world, and then they think the AI is a kind of a magic that just brings something on top. And I think this is the two biggest mistakes. So as I said in my speech is, start with questions problem you want to answer, which data you need to answer these questions, which processes, and then you like you would do with any physical problem.
You make it sound so easy.
I mean, the problem is they love to do what we call POC, and then they don't scale. They love to have magicians coming, they say that they are AI whatever, and then nothing happens. And then after they are so disappointed that they say, AI doesn't work, let's go back to normal things. Or they spend years, and I know a very large corporate who spent 3 years just building the data lake. Yeah. And then nothing happens.
So maybe let's come back to this from an investor perspective. Let's assume those premises that you outline are there, where, whether it's a board or whether it's from an investor coming from the outside, is actually finding there's a lot of what we say in the UK as sort of woods and trees. It's very hard to tell where actually the real artificial intelligence that will, as you say, if applied correctly, make a difference to their business is. Maybe, Gilad, you could talk through a bit of your experience from seeing, I'm sure, a lot of AI technology coming through. How do you differentiate?
So I think it's like, first of all, when I'm actually looking at the investment, no matter whether it's an AI or a different investment, I'm looking in the same way. So I'm actually checking the entrepreneurs. I'm doing a little bit of a background check on them to understand whether they are actually first-time entrepreneurs, they're actually expert entrepreneurs, and that's a very important element because they're the ones that need to deliver at the end of the day. Secondly, when we actually get into the technology, what we try to understand, whether it's actually holding any water, and how do we do that? So we can compare to a lot of other companies that are doing kind of a similar, trying to solve kind of a similar problem. And the way is actually to give it to either internally our data analysts to run the platform of those AI companies to see what are the results that they're actually getting out of the tools that they developed. And secondly is the ability to actually get a comparison from external companies. So there are actually companies that actually check the technology in a way that will give us rating for the different companies.
So it sounds like that's actually quite similar to some of the thinking that's gone into what Alexandra has been setting up from a Tortoise Media perspective. Would you recognize that as one of the sort of key tools for assessment of AI?
I mean, I think in terms of benchmarking, that would tell you something about, the maturity of the investment and how it's applied. It would tell you something about the capacity of the country going forward. And if you roll that up to a national level, it'll give you a good insight into how that country is doing. So, and as you know, I come from a ratings background, so I'm a big fan of the rating system. So if you apply it in that context as well, I think that's good. But I do think that it speaks to, if you are able to track that, if you're able to track how that is progressing, and being able to mark that in terms of maturity, it will, obviously, if you roll that up, that would give you really good sense of, the data sets that we're using for the index are, it's we use a lot of proxies too, because they're not that easy to access. A lot of this is really new, it's new territory. How do you measure agility and flexibility? Some of the investment sides are more, the investment environment is probably more straightforward, but how do you get to points about, how well a country is doing in terms of focusing on skills alignment, right? So, do you measure the amount of hackathons that are going on inside or outside a company? Hackathons can speak to the development at the front end, but it can also point to the level of training corporates are doing internally, because hackathons are used for that. So we're looking at all kinds of different data points that would speak to that. So if we can get to something that is benchmarking where an investment lies, that is actually not something we've incorporated, or maybe we should consider it. But we also, look at things like trust and try and get an assessment of, how AI is being debated in the open space, and obviously there's a high correlation between countries that are trustful of change that will have an easier time to adapt. So we look at those data points as well. They're not the be-all and end-all, but they're part of the whole puzzle of data that we look at when we're looking at how well we think nations will cope with this rapidly changing environment in the future.
I'm imagining that one of the data points that you'll look at when you're trying to make those assessments that you describe is actually the role that governments play. Mm-hmm. And having you, Antonia, on the panel, I'd love to get a sense from you about where you think governments can make a difference here.
Well, look, first of all, on the trust point, one of the things that governments can do is to help set that standard. I mentioned ethics already, so the OECD principles on AI, which the UK has signed up to, a number of other countries have as well. That's going to be really important in terms of establishing what is good use for AI, be it in sustainability or whatever else. Overall, I think there are probably three things governments do. One is obviously funding. It shouldn't just be government funding. You don't want government to be funding most of it, but nonetheless, in the UK, we announced as part of the AI sector deal, 1,000 AI PhDs over the next 5 years will be funded by government. So things like that can help generate some more of the talent that we've been talking about. And obviously, many other countries also injecting funding into their systems. Secondly, it's structures. So it is things like, the AI Council, the Office for AI, the way in which you can bring together academia, business, government. And that's, I think, the responsibility to bring that together, to convene, is a lot of part of what government does as well. And finally, on this data sets point, government can drive some of the demand. So, for example, through NHSX, we're driving the demand for, it's the data set in health that starts to trigger the supply side of what AI can do in terms of practical solutions. And again, this isn't something just government does, because something like, one of the reasons the UK has done well in AI is because we have a very successful financial services sector that has been a demand driver of AI for decades. But it's an area where government, thinking about data sets that it holds and how it can ethically release those data sets for use for the public good, can actually help stimulate AI and practical application of AI in areas that really matter.
I wanted to maybe just pick on the first of the points you raised about government investment. Given the session is around investment, and as you rightly said in your initial keynote, countries like China are funding multi-billions into this area of AI investment. What is the panel's perspective, I don't know who might want to pick this up, on what's the right type of government investment intervention? What's the wrong type of government investment intervention? Please, Eric.
So I can, there's some of this from my experience in the U.S. federal government that I agree with, and some that I may not. What I've seen is that research funding is extremely powerful early stage research investing can make the difference in having a lead in fundamental technologies or not. I think this speaks to a big reason that Israel has such a strong technology industry in general, and particularly in AI, is you have socially motivated people for higher education and strong government funding for high technology. Around training, I don't know how many more AI PhDs we need in the world. And people like me, we provide value at a particular layer, but there is a huge need for people doing applied artificial intelligence. I guess I can continue to bang on that drum, but we have, I'll just generically say, in the United States, we have Trump voters that do not want to be an AI PhD, and yet need to be participating in this economy. I think every country is going to need to facilitate people that are not the same people that are going to go work for Google, Facebook, Alibaba, or whomever. They are different people for different needs, and there's millions of jobs in generically the system of AI available for these people. That's another place that the government can encourage participation in different ways.
If I may add, actually, for the Israeli system, so I'm actually sitting on the investment committee of the Israeli Innovation Authority, which is part of the government contribution to the ecosystem, and we tend to invest a lot of money into startups that usually VCs will not actually give them any money. By that, we increase the potential of maybe high-risk investment to become successful in the future, and that's something very unique and special.
Charles-Edouard, were you going to comment?
No, I was really much supportive of Eric's point. I think let's not forget that the people who see the future are first the sci-fi writer, then the military, then the business people. And if you want to be up in the race, you have the future technology. So it's no surprise that the superpower of this world, or Israel, have a strong stance on AI, because AI, and it's not the topic of CogX, is a weapon. It's potentially the most powerful weapon. If you want to just strike a country, you just stop the system using powerful AI and just shut down electricity and everything, and the country is off. So the first thing is the country needs to protect itself, and to protect itself, you invest in very long-term, high-risk research. The second thing, which is critical, is the country needs to give a clear direction to the entrepreneurs and the VC of the economic environment that they will have in terms of capital gain, in terms of application and regulation. Because if you have a too strict regulation, nothing will happen. And last but not least, you need to have the right financing and funding.
So let's step back to the sort of global investment climate as a whole. I'd love to get a sense from all of you about where you think there is too little investment going in terms of AI technologies, and where there might be too much. We're seeing a lot of investment in, for example, autonomous systems. All over the world, we're seeing lots and lots of money plowed into that. Is that the right focus? Should we be seeing better investment in other areas? You're giggling there,
yes,
Eric.
we're all
Please
giggling.
come in.
I'm giggling because when you don't understand AI, that you're going to think the easy is hard and the hard is easy, and the phrase we often have in Silicon Valley investing, when I did that professionally, is we'd say, don't confuse a clear vision for a short time horizon. And that's what I see in autonomous vehicles, right? So I see those outside my office every day in San Francisco, every day. And there was a Zoox car out there the other day, and it came to the six-way intersection, and it was startled. It was kind of jumpy, and then cars behind it were honking. I mean, this is the stage of autonomous vehicles we're in. Elon Musk is, he should go smoke another joint, because there's no way we're going to have autonomous taxis in the next years. There's no way. Regulatory issues will preclude that, if nothing else. But the technology's not there at all. Huge overinvestment. It's an enormous market, but a huge overinvestment. The underinvestment is in data, and in data migration and data integration. This is where companies fail. And there is no AI without verifiable integrated data. So there's insufficient investment in the biggest part of the gap between theory and practice in computer science.
And I would support, because basically people are going for the big thing, like autonomous car, and they're not going for the zillion of small things that you can really do. And that's why I was saying that the GAFA and the BAT, they're just not doing any magic. They're just using verified data and applying basic machine learning, and then they get huge results.
Alexandra, that sort of merges your two worlds, doesn't it? You're doing data analysis of AI, but with this right assessment, I think that more money should be going into the data analysis. Is that something you'd resonate with?
Yeah, but I think one of the things that we find when we are asking, what keeps you up at night in terms of what's missing and what are your bottlenecks is talent. And so the investment, as you pointed out, the UK is doing a huge effort in investing into future talent capacity, but that seems to be the bottleneck every time. I mean, there are lots of issues, but that is a key one. So
maybe Antonia, I could come back to you on that talent piece then, because clearly, it is going to be one of the clear drivers, but as with so many other areas, it's hard to understand where to prioritize. So talk us through a bit about the UK's thinking on how we train people for the jobs of the future.
Okay, so two things on that. And thanks for tossing me that ball, because I wanted to say something about that. The first is, talent is hugely important. So government shouldn't be poking around in this. I mean, you talked around, the sci-fi writers, the defense, cyber brigade, business. Government is somewhere back here. I mean, we listen to business. It's the businesses saying to us, we need more talent. This is the big global investors. We want to come to the UK. We're looking for more talent, and indeed the UK companies saying we can't find it. That's why we're funding more PhDs in AI, because that's what business wants in order to grow in this. We shouldn't be making the decisions. We're not in the business of picking winners. I think your point, though, Priya, is really important, which is one thing that government is going to have to do is to help countries adjust to the new world, because as we're going to end up in a space as we do when we see major changes in society, major technological change, and the so-called fourth industrial revolution is going to drive a complete shift in what jobs look like. So we're having, like all major economies, we're having to think in government about how we are going to both reskill, but also skill for the new jobs, people who aren't yet in the workforce. And that's a big part of actually that investment, which is connected with AI, if you like. It's connected with the new world that we'll need to be in, and that is the responsibility of government.
Anyone else want to come in on that theme? Gilad, please.
Yeah, one thing is that one of the biggest challenges is actually the interaction of AI technologies and the human element. So this is whether it's PhDs, but what I see as a trend now for AI companies is actually to make that experience much more simple. So you don't really have to be a PhD in order to analyze data sets. So you have a lot of ways to actually make it much more simple. That will actually impact also the employment and education in that sense.
So let's look at sort of from an opportunity perspective. I think, we've all identified that AI will be driving so much of what we need in the future. How can investment play a role in stimulating just more AI, more applied AI, as you rightly said earlier? How can investment play a role in this game? Eric.
There's a British economist, Jepson. I was talking to a friend earlier about this, that 100 years ago, 150 years ago, I think, I was getting my British references in advance of this panel.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
It was a British economist. So he established this thing called the Jepson's paradox back in the days where the UK was still mining for coal. And the argument back then was, once we become more efficient, the UK becomes more efficient in mining coal, will the consumption of coal then go up or down? And the idea was, we need a certain output. Therefore, if we are more efficient in the coal, we need less coal for the same output, we'll just keep the same output and mine less coal. Of course, that did not happen. In fact, the opposite happened. We dramatically increased the rate of consumption of coal when the inefficiency increased. That's my historical narrative that I think applies to AI. Once we cure the bottleneck that is right now verifiable data integration and migration, I think you will see the explosion of AI that you properly predicted in your talk. Really an explosion that's just virtually unimaginable. Even smart people living day to day could not have predicted the smartphone back in 2004, could certainly not have predicted the app store, in 2004. And that's, I think, the degree of uncertainty we have around the future of artificial intelligence and the explosion we'll have once that particular problem is solved. So I completely agree with the future you outlined.
To build on you, Eric, this will make really the difference between the people that succeed and because once this race will go, some companies, as I said at the beginning of the speech, will have no license to exist anymore because the gap will be so huge. I mean, when we look at some of the results, you can be 10 times faster, 20 times cheaper. Imagine in some industries, if the producer of this is 20 times cheaper, within a few months, it's just override the competition. And that's something that's going to happen very soon, I think.
So that very transformational vision you describe requires interventions for it to happen. So what is the role of investment in changing that dial to that sort of much more widespread mass adoption that you describe?
I think, as Eric said, it needs to be applied to real companies. I think today we have three worlds. We have the government trying to step up on the computer vision, controlling and stuff. We have crazy investment on autonomous vehicle and a lot of startups, but then the real companies are not moving, as I showed in my slide. Less than 20% of the companies are really doing something. And we need to focus on helping companies, as you said, getting things done.
You talk to companies, if you actually try implementing AI, it actually can be pretty hard. It's because each of these industries have their own nomenclature, their own ontology. And applying these learning tools into particular industries is going to require a specialization that I think is completely underappreciated even by the people that work in those industries. Your knowledge outside of AI is valuable. That's a takeaway.
Antonia, I'm guessing you're thinking there's a few other elements that might go into making that picture a reality. Well, what are you thinking there?
On investment.
On changing this vision from where we are today to the sort of mass adoption, and I think we're hearing that the focus is very much around corporate adoption. What else are you thinking?
Well, so obviously, I mean, as discussed, right, there's an issue about talent, but there's an issue about data and data sets. And I mean, one of the reasons why the two leading countries in the world, US and China, is they've got scale. So the question is, where can you find the data sets that have scale? How we're big believers in open data to allow the AI to be developed. But then beyond that, how you can apply it in a way that it can be scaled up to become valuable to society. And I think that from a government perspective, we don't want to pick winners and decide that, but we can look at areas where, as part of in our case, as part of our industrial strategy, we can look at what are the things we need to look at, the future of mobility, aging, climate change. What are the big things that are happening in the world where this sort of technology can be put to good use? And so, and then how we invest. I believe an investment in R&D is the key thing. How we are investing at the research end in order to help drive that. But again, we've got to do it along with the private sector as well.
To build on this, I was at the United Nations and you're wearing the badge, for the AI for Good.
Yep.
And there's this initiative called AI Commons, where we put data sets available and we ask people to use them and they need to tell what they would use it for. And I think if we can start to provide this qualified data, verified data to people, we can really get things going. Yeah.
The issue about data actually is there's very few applications that have very large data. And that many people, when we're actually implementing data, are using wrong tools because it's a little bit like going after sports stars and we want to emulate sports stars. And so in our AI, often we will misappropriate their tools because we will aspire to be like a Google or Facebook engineer and we will use tools for internet scale data when we do not have internet scale data today. And why we don't is because the tools don't exist to verifiably integrate the data.
And I think that's exactly where that point about collaboration is going to be key. I know we're coming down to the end of our session, so if I may just use that point of sort of collaboration between all of the different examples and countries and companies that you've highlighted to look towards an optimistic future, and any sort of last thoughts you might want to share about the future of the investment climate. Any last thoughts for what you might think it will look like, something we've not covered?
I'm going to say AI is underhyped.
You're just trying to sell your book, aren't you, Eric?
You need to send us the free book to all of us.
Exactly.
That's the penalty for
Well,
advertising.
I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel for a really fascinating discussion. Thank you.